My friends, let us begin by considering something very simple, yet something that has eluded the spiritual seeker for generations. Every day, millions approach God with sincerity, with longing, with deep yearning in the heart. And yet, for all their earnest prayers, very little in their inner life changes. They ask, they plead, they wait for God to move, and sooner or later they come to believe that God is either slow, silent, or withholding. But I tell you now, that is not the truth. The difficulty is never in God. The difficulty is always in our concept of prayer. From childhood, we have been trained to think of prayer as an attempt to reach a distant being, a God somewhere outside ourselves who must be persuaded, convinced, or impressed. And so the seeker grows up believing that the right words, the right posture, the right intensity of pleading will somehow cause God to act. But if God is infinite love, if God is all-knowing, all-present, and all-providing, what is there for God to withhold? What is there for God to delay? What more can infinite fullness offer than its own infinite nature? No, the trouble is not in God's willingness. The trouble is in our understanding. We have approached prayer as though we lack something that God possesses. We have prayed as though God is over there and we are over here, and the purpose of prayer is to bridge that distance. But listen carefully now. There is no distance to bridge. There is no separation to overcome. God is not afar off waiting for your cry. God is the very life of your being, the presence within you, the consciousness by which you know you exist. When we pray as though God is absent, we reinforce the illusion of absence. When we pray as though God must be convinced, we strengthen the belief that God is reluctant. When we pray as though we are sinners trying to secure a touch of holiness, we deepen the dream that we are something other than the offspring of the infinite. And so before we move one step further, let us establish the foundation upon which all true prayer rests. Prayer is not an attempt to change God's mind about you. Prayer is the awakening that changes your mind about God, about yourself, and about the nature of reality. Prayer is not a cry sent outward. Prayer is a recognition arising inward. Prayer is not a request. Prayer is awareness. As we move deeper into this teaching, it will become clear to you why most of the prayers you have offered in your lifetime have brought so little lasting transformation. Not because you were unworthy, not because God was silent, but because you were addressing a God imagined outside your own being, and that God does not exist. There is only one God, and that God is the living presence within the source, the life, the consciousness of your very existence. As long as you pray to a God apart, you remain in the illusion of separation. But the moment you recognize the presence within, prayer becomes communion, and communion becomes realization. This is the secret that transforms the entire spiritual life. And it begins simply by acknowledging, I am not praying to bring God nearer. God is already here. That is our starting point for everything that follows. Now let us look more closely at the form of prayer. Most of the world has practiced what I call begging prayer. You know this prayer well. It is the prayer that pleads, God, please help me. God, please fix this. God, please give me. And it seems sincere. It seems humble. But its very foundation is built upon a false premise, and therefore the results it produces are limited, uncertain, and temporary. When you pray as a beggar, you are proclaiming without realizing it that you are separated from God. You are declaring that God has something you do not have, that God is somewhere you are not, that God must be convinced to act, to intervene, to remember you. But how can you convince infinite love to love? How can you persuade omnipresence to be present? How can you bargain with the life that is already breathing you, sustaining you, expressing as you? My friends, begging God does not work because there is no God who withholds anything. There is no God who sits in judgment deciding when and to whom blessing shall flow. The very nature of infinite good is perpetual, eternal giving, unceasing, unbroken, uninterrupted. The sun does not withhold its light and then release it when someone pleads long enough. And God, who is the very source of all light and life, withholds nothing. But listen carefully now. When you approach God as though you are outside the circle of divine fullness, you experience life as though you are outside that fullness. The prayer itself becomes the barrier, not because God rejects it, but because the prayer springs from a consciousness of lack, and consciousness is the law of experience. When you pray from fear, you continue to dwell in fear. When you pray from guilt, you remain imprisoned in guilt. When you pray from unworthiness, you reinforce unworthiness. When you pray for something, you affirm that you do not have it. And when you affirm that you do not have it, you continue not to have it. Let us be very clear. It is not that begging angers God. God is not offended. God is not moved either closer or farther by your words. But the act of begging keeps the mind fixed in a state of separation, and as long as the mind dwells in separation, it cannot perceive the presence that is already within. This is why begging produces such little transformation. It is not that God ignores it, but that the prayer itself is built upon a premise that is untrue. It asks the infinite to become more infinite. It asks completeness to become more complete. It asks presence to draw near. It asks love to become loving. And so, my friends, the issue has never been God's willingness. The issue has always been the consciousness from which we pray. Begging is the voice of a mind blind to its own divine origin. Recognition is the voice of a mind awakening to truth. When you understand this, you realize that the failure of begging prayer is not a spiritual disappointment, it is a spiritual opportunity. It invites you to step out of the illusion that God stands apart from you. It calls you to discover a deeper form of prayer, a higher dimension of communion, in which you no longer seek God as though God were missing, but recognize God as the very life and identity of your own being. In a few moments, we will explore that recognition. But first, allow yourself to gently release the last thread of belief that you must persuade God to notice you. God has never been unaware of you. God has never been absent from you. God has never held anything back from the expression that you are. The moment you understand this, you stand at the threshold of a new kind of prayer. Let us now enter the heart of this teaching, for the whole spiritual path turns upon this one realization. When the seeker grows weary of begging, when pleading no longer satisfies, when the soul becomes tired of trying to wrest something from God, there arises a quiet question within. If God truly is all, why must I strive so hard to find what is already everywhere? And in that moment, the door opens to a new dimension of prayer, what I call recognition. Recognition is the highest form of prayer because it does not attempt to draw God to you. It acknowledges that God is already here. It does not attempt to awaken God. It awakens you. It does not attempt to move the infinite. It allows the infinite to reveal itself where it already is. In recognition, prayer is no longer directed outward. It is not aimed toward the heavens. It is not projected toward a distant throne. Recognition is the inward turning that discovers the presence at the center of one's own being. It is the still, restful awareness that says, not as affirmation, not as hope, but as spiritual fact, God is here. God is the life I am. God is the consciousness by which I know this moment. I am not seeking God. I am recognizing God. Do you see the profound shift? Begging assumes absence. Recognition assumes presence. Begging springs from fear. Recognition springs from truth. Begging imagines separation. Recognition reveals oneness. This is why I have often said, prayer is not something you do. Prayer is something you awaken to. When you enter into recognition, you are not constructing a prayer. You are not forming thoughts and presenting them to God. You are not trying to bend the divine will in your favor. Rather, you are allowing the false sense of separation to dissolve so that the presence may shine through you unobstructed. Let me assure you, this is not positive thinking. It is not mental suggestion. It is not a technique designed to achieve results. Recognition is the simple and sacred acknowledgement of what eternally is. Truth does not need your persuasion. Truth requires only your awareness. When you turn inward, not to your emotions, not to your intellect, but to the silent core of your being, you discover a profound stillness. And in that stillness, something becomes evident that words cannot adequately express. You and God are not two. There is no you here and God there. There is only the one life appearing as your life, the one mind appearing as your awareness, the one presence manifesting as your very existence. Recognition is the unveiling of this reality. In this state of inner knowing, you do not ask for supply. You recognize that the infinite is the source of all supply, and therefore lack cannot define you. You do not ask for healing. You recognize that divine wholeness is the truth of your being, and therefore disease cannot alter your identity. You do not ask for God to guide you. You recognize that infinite intelligence is the mind by which you know truth, and therefore direction flows naturally. Recognition changes everything, not because God becomes more present, but because you have become more aware of the presence that never left. And the moment you touch this awareness, prayer ceases to be an effort. Prayer becomes communion, and communion becomes realization. My friends, once you taste recognition, you will never again be satisfied with pleading. You will never again feel compelled to convince God to act on your behalf. Instead, you will rest deeply, quietly, confidently in the truth that God is the silent reality of your own being, and that all good flows from that realization. This is the turning point. From this moment forward, prayer is no longer an attempt to reach God. Prayer becomes the discovery that God has been the substance of your own life all along. As we proceed now, let us turn our attention to the very center of spiritual realization, the true nature of God. For until we understand what God is, we cannot understand prayer, and until we understand prayer, we cannot understand ourselves. All spiritual confusion rests upon misconceptions of God, and so we must clear away these illusions with quiet, gentle clarity. For centuries, humanity has imagined God in its own image, a larger, more powerful version of a human being. A God who approves, who disapproves. A God who rewards and withholds. A God who comes and goes. A God who judges, reacts, responds in time. But, my friends, such a God does not exist. That is a God formed in the mind of man, and therefore bound by the limitations of the mind that conceived it. Let us set aside once and for all the notion of a God who resembles a magnified human personality. God is not a person. God is not a superhuman. God is not an object in space, nor a force that moves at intervals. God is infinite presence, unbounded, unconfined, indivisible. God is the very essence of life, the substance of being, the intelligence that animates all existence. When we say God is infinite, we mean exactly that. Infinity has no edges, no borders, no boundaries. Infinity cannot be contained in a location. Infinity does not begin in one place and end in another. Therefore, the very idea of God being over there while you are over here is impossible. Infinity cannot be absent from any point in its own being. This is the great truth. Where you are, God is, because God fills all space with its own presence. You cannot step outside of infinity. You cannot enter where it is not. You cannot draw it nearer because it has never been far. You cannot call it to you because it has never ceased to abide within you. Consider the nature of light. Light needs no permission to shine. It needs no command to radiate. It is the nature of light to reveal itself, to fill whatever space it touches. But even the brilliance of sunlight is only a faint illustration of the nature of God, for God is not merely light, it is the very source of all light, the life within all life, the wisdom within all intelligence. If God is infinite presence, then God cannot withhold. Infinity cannot diminish itself. Infinity cannot restrict itself. Infinity cannot reduce its nature to favor one and exclude another. The very thought that God might withhold good, delay good, ration good, or allocate good is spiritually impossible. The infinite cannot be partial. The infinite cannot be selective. The infinite is the fullness of good, pouring itself forth endlessly. This understanding shatters the foundation of fear. For if God is truly infinite good, then good is not something you must convince God to release. Good is the nature of reality itself. It is the atmosphere in which your being exists. And every fear, every lack, every shadow is merely the mind's temporary blindness to that reality. When you pray to a God you imagine must be persuaded, you are praying to an illusion. But when you rest in the awareness of God as infinite presence, always expressing itself as your very life, you are dwelling in truth, and truth reveals itself in peace. Let this become clear within you. God is not something to be attained. God is something to be recognized. Not because God is absent, but because we have been asleep. The infinite cannot come to you. It is already here. The eternal cannot begin for you. It already is. The divine cannot improve toward you. It is perfect now. When you understand the true nature of God, begging becomes impossible. What remains is recognition, silent, restful, profound. And in that recognition, your entire relationship with prayer changes, because your entire understanding of God changes. And now, having seen what God is, we must turn to the next great revelation, the true nature of you. And now, my friends, having paused to consider the true nature of God, we must turn to the second half of the great equation, the true nature of you. For if you hold a mistaken concept of God, your spiritual life will be filled with confusion. But if you hold a mistaken concept of yourself, your spiritual life will be filled with struggle. It is only when both are seen clearly that prayer becomes a living communion and not an act of desperation. Let me say something that may startle you at first, yet will feel strangely familiar the moment it settles into your heart. You are not a sinner seeking God's approval. You are God's spiritual offspring, expressing the very nature of the infinite. Not someday, not after repentance, not after improvement, not after spiritual achievement. Now, as you sit here, as you breathe, as you listen, your true identity is not the personality you have cultivated nor the story you have lived. Your true identity is not your successes or your failures, your virtues or your mistakes. These are experiences in time, but they are not the essence of your being. They come and they go, but the reality of you remains unchanged. The real you, the spiritual you, is the expression of God's own being, individualized as your life, not separate from the source, but one with it, not created from God, as though fashioned from divine material, but existing in God, inseparable, indivisible, eternal. I tell you this, nothing you have ever done has altered your spiritual identity, because identity is not shaped by human experience. It is established by God and maintained by God. You may have walked through guilt, but guilt has not touched the truth of you. You may have suffered, but suffering has not scarred the essence of you. You may have erred, but error has not stained the reality of you. You may have believed yourself unworthy, but belief does not alter divine fact. And here is the great paradox. The more you identify with the human sense of self, weak, flawed, fearful, the more you pray from that identity. And the more you pray from that identity, the more you reinforce its illusion. A beggar prays like a beggar. A guilty mind prays like a guilty mind. A fearful heart prays like a fearful heart. And each of these prayers strengthens the very condition it seeks to escape. But the moment you recognize who you truly are, prayer is transformed. When you know yourself as God's child, not symbolically, not poetically, but factually, your entire approach to prayer changes. You no longer beg for good. You recognize good as the nature of your being. You no longer plead for God's presence. You realize that presence is the life functioning as you. You no longer attempt to earn love. You awaken to the truth that love is the fabric of your identity. This is why Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is within you." He did not mean it metaphorically. He meant that the fullness of God, the essence of God, the life of God, is already implanted within your consciousness, not to be gained, but to be realized. Not to be achieved, but to be uncovered. The spiritual life is not the effort to become something other than what you are. The spiritual life is the awakening to the fact that you cannot be anything other than what God created you to be. Recognition prayer rests upon this truth. God is the infinite presence. You are the expression of that presence. Therefore, prayer is not a bridge between two separated beings. Prayer is the awareness of oneness. Think for a moment what this means. It means that prayer is not your attempt to rise to God. Prayer is the moment you remember that you never left. And with this remembrance, with this quiet inner recognition, something profound begins to shift within you. You cease praying from fear. You cease praying from guilt. You cease praying from lack. You pray from identity, from truth, from the awareness that the life which is God is the same life that breathes as you. To understand God is to understand yourself. To understand yourself is to understand prayer. And when these three are seen as one, prayer becomes effortless, natural, transformative. Now that we have seen who you truly are, we can move even deeper into the heart of this teaching, how recognition prayer works. Now that we have glimpsed both the nature of God and the nature of your being, let us turn to the practical heart of the matter. How does one actually pray through recognition? How is this lived? How is this entered? For it is one thing to understand truth intellectually. It is another to allow that truth to become the atmosphere of your daily consciousness. Recognition prayer is unlike every form of prayer you have known. It is not spoken, it is not composed, it is not crafted, it is not an arrangement of words designed to evoke divine response. Recognition prayer is the silent unveiling of what is. It is the sacred practice of turning from the illusion of separation to the awareness of oneness. And though it is simple, it requires sincerity. It requires willingness. It requires the humility to stop reaching outward and begin resting inward. Let me describe the process as clearly as possible, not as a technique, but as a way of being. First, become still. Do not approach this with strain or effort. You are not trying to enter a spiritual state. You are allowing the mind to quiet its frantic motion so that what is already present may reveal itself. Sit or stand, it matters not. What matters is the willingness to be still. Second, release the desire to get something from God. This is the great turning point. As long as you enter prayer seeking a result, healing, supply, guidance, you are approaching God as a means to an end. But God is not a means. God is the end. God is the fullness. God is the very substance of your being. When you drop all desire to get, prayer becomes pure. Third, recognize that God is here, not as a thought, not as an emotion, not as a sensation, but as a living presence. The presence that fills the room. The presence that fills your awareness. The presence that cannot be absent because it is infinite. Simply acknowledge this not as a mantra, but as truth. Fourth, recognize that this presence is your very identity. This is the highest recognition. God is not merely near you. God is the life that you are living. God is the consciousness by which you think, the breath by which you breathe, the awareness by which you know this moment. You are not trying to connect with God. You are realizing that connection is the eternal fact of your being. Fifth, rest in silent awareness. No words, no requests, no mental activity designed to achieve anything. You are not thinking about God. You are not imagining God. You are simply being, and in that beingness, the presence reveals itself. This is communion. This is prayer. This is the moment when illusion fades and truth dawns. In this inner silence, things happen that no mind can plan. Fears dissolve without effort. Clarity appears without reasoning. Peace flows without pursuit. Why? Because in the silence, you have ceased interfering with the action of the infinite. You have stopped attempting to live life by your own strength and have allowed God to live its life as you. Recognition prayer is not a doing, it is an allowing. It is not an attempt to create truth. It is the invitation for truth to reveal itself. It is not a method for producing spiritual results. It is the awareness that spiritual reality is already complete. You do not pray to change conditions. You pray to see through them. You do not pray to bring God into the situation. You pray to recognize that God is the only presence within the situation. You do not pray to invite God to act. You pray to become aware of the divine activity already at work. And as this recognition deepens, something profound begins to happen. Conditions that once seemed immovable begin to shift. Not because God finally heard you, but because your consciousness opened to the truth that had been present all along. This is the secret of recognition prayer. It is the prayer of realization, not request. It is the prayer of identity, not effort. It is the prayer of communion, not communication. And now that you understand the process itself, it is time to witness how this inner shift transforms real lives. For truth, once recognized, demonstrates itself. Now let us turn to something very important, how recognition manifests in actual human lives. For spiritual truth, when realized, always expresses itself. It cannot remain hidden. It cannot remain theoretical. When the consciousness shifts, the outer life reflects that shift as naturally as light dispels darkness. But the change does not begin with conditions. It begins in the invisible sanctuary of the heart. Let me share with you some illustrations, not as miracles, not as supernatural events, but as demonstrations of what happens when an individual ceases to pray as a beggar and begins to pray as one awakening to truth. There was a woman who lived many years in the heavy shadow of guilt. She had made decisions she deeply regretted, and for nearly 15 years she prayed the only way she knew, begging God for forgiveness, pleading for relief from the burden she carried. And although she prayed with sincerity, her heart remained troubled, her body weakened, and her life seemed locked in a cycle of sorrow. One day, she encountered this teaching of recognition. She heard the words, "Can God's child ever cease to be God's child?" And something in her stopped. She had been praying as a sinner seeking mercy. She had never once prayed as the expression of God's own life. And as she sat with this, a realization quietly dawned. Her mistakes belonged to the human story, but her identity did not. Her spiritual identity had never been touched by her past. In that recognition, something dissolved within her. The guilt did not disappear instantly, but its power was broken. Her prayers changed. She no longer begged for forgiveness. She rested in the truth that divine love had never left her. Over the next months, her health improved, opportunities opened, and the heaviness that once consumed her gradually lifted. The outer shifts were not the cause, they were the evidence of an inner awakening. Then there was a man who had spent years in constant fear of failing God, fear of disappointing others, fear of never measuring up. His prayers were full of anxiety. Every morning he asked God to make him better, holier, worthier, and still he struggled. His health suffered, his relationships strained. He believed he lacked spiritual discipline. But the truth was simpler. He was praying from a false identity. When he learned that prayer was not an appeal to God, but an inner recognition of unity with God, he felt at first as though he were deceiving himself. How could he claim to be God's expression when he felt so inadequate? But the teaching was clear. You are not creating truth, you are acknowledging what already is. So each day he practiced a few minutes of quiet recognition. No words, no requests, no effort, just the gentle awareness. God is here. God is my life. I am living by the life of God. Within weeks, the fear began to loosen. His sleep returned. His mind became calm. His body responded. And he discovered something wonderful. As he stopped judging himself, he stopped projecting judgment onto others. His relationships softened, healed, and opened, not because he tried to change them, but because consciousness changed. Another person, a mother caring for her children, overwhelmed by financial strain, approached prayer as a battleground. She prayed for solutions, for resources, for relief. Yet the more she prayed, the more fearful she became. When she encountered recognition, she heard something that felt impossible but somehow true. Infinite supply is the very nature of the presence within you. She had been seeking supply outside, but supply cannot be found in the outer world. It can only appear outwardly after it is recognized inwardly. And so, instead of praying for money, she began to rest each morning in the awareness that the infinite is the source of all good, and that this infinite is the life expressing as her and for her. She did not deny the bills. She simply refused to let appearances define consciousness. Gradually, her fear quieted, her thinking cleared, and she began seeing possibilities she had never considered. In time, her situation shifted, new work, unexpected openings, stability. But the true miracle was her inner transformation. She no longer lived as one abandoned by God, but as one upheld by the presence. My friends, these stories all point to one truth. Consciousness creates experience. When consciousness is filled with fear, fear appears. When consciousness awakens to truth, truth unfolds. Recognition does not manipulate circumstances. It reveals the divine harmony already present beneath them. It does not bring God into the human situation. It awakens us to the God who is the only presence within the situation. And so I tell you, your life does not transform because God suddenly acts on your behalf. Your life transforms because you cease blocking the flow of divine good with the belief that you are separate from it. This is the power of recognition prayer. This is the quiet revolution that unfolds when we remember who we are and who God is. And now, let us bring this into daily living, into the simple moments where the presence can reveal itself most clearly. Up to this point, we have spoken of recognition as though it were something entered during moments of quiet. But now we must take the next step, for spiritual realization is not meant to be confined to meditation. It must flow into the very fabric of daily living. It must move with you into the marketplace, into your home, into your work, into every encounter and circumstance. For the presence is not limited to holy moments. The presence is the very substance of life itself. The question arises, how do I live from recognition when the demands of the day press upon me? How do I remain aware of truth when fear, conflict, or uncertainty arise? The answer is simple, though not always easy. You return again and again to the inner awareness that God is the only presence, the only power, the only life functioning in this moment. You do not wait for ideal conditions. You do not wait for silence or solitude. You do not wait until fear has passed or obstacles have vanished. You bring recognition into the midst of your circumstances, and in that bringing, the circumstances lose their power over you. Let us consider a practical example. Suppose you wake in the morning and a sense of anxiety is already present. The human mind immediately tries to resolve it, to analyze it, to fix it. But the spiritual consciousness does something entirely different. It pauses, it breathes, it remembers. God is here. God is the presence of my very being. Nothing can separate me from the infinite that lives me. You need not force calm. You need not suppress emotion. You simply return to truth, even for a few seconds. And what you will discover is that those few seconds have more healing power than an hour of anxious thinking. Or perhaps during the day you face a difficult conversation or a conflict that seems unmovable. The instinct is to react, to defend, to control, to resist. But in recognition, you pause before responding. Even a single breath of awareness is enough. You acknowledge silently, there is only one presence here, expressing itself as all. And from that awareness, you speak not as a frightened human attempting to navigate conflict, but as one centered in divine clarity. The words that arise from this center carry peace, not tension. They carry wisdom, not impulse. They carry love, not fear. You will find that many situations that once seemed complicated dissolve of their own accord when you no longer approach them from the human sense of separation. It is the presence that handles the details. It is the presence that guides the next step. It is the presence that harmonizes what you once struggled to manage alone. Consider also the moments when fear of lack arises, financial pressure, uncertainty about the future. doubt about your security. Instead of asking God to provide, you return inward and recognize God is the infinite source of all supply, and this source is the life expressing as me. You do not deny the appearance. You simply refuse to let the appearance define your consciousness. And as consciousness stabilizes in truth, the outward situation responds, not magically, not by bypassing natural order, but through the natural unfolding of clarity, opportunity, and right action. This is what it means to live. Recognition. You do not wait for trouble to pass. You do not wait for external reassurance. You do not wait for conditions to improve before remembering truth. You remember truth in the midst of whatever arises. Each time you turn inward, even for a moment, you shift the axis of your life from human effort to divine flow. And as this becomes habitual, something beautiful occurs. You begin to discover that recognition is not something you occasionally practice. It becomes the very atmosphere of your being. It becomes a background awareness that supports every activity, every decision, every interaction. You walk through the day not as one struggling to reach God, but as one resting in the presence that is living you. You respond to life from peace rather than from panic, from wisdom rather than from worry, from truth rather than from fear. And in this way, daily life itself becomes the field of spiritual realization. The world does not change first. You change first. And as your consciousness changes, the world takes on a different appearance, not because it alters, but because you now behold it through the lens of truth. This is the secret of daily spiritual living, the willingness to return again and again to the silent awareness that God is here, God is now, God is the life you are. In that returning, everything becomes simpler. Everything becomes clearer. Everything becomes peace. And now, having brought this teaching into the living of each day, we are ready for the final movement of this journey, the closing recognition that draws all things together. And now, my friends, we come to the gentle close of this unfolding, not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new way of walking it. We have seen the illusion behind begging prayers. We have seen the futility of reaching for a God imagined outside ourselves. We have seen the error of approaching infinite presence as though it were distant, reluctant, or withholding. And in their place, we have uncovered the quiet, sacred truth of recognition, prayer as awakening, prayer as communion, prayer as the natural realization of oneness. As we conclude, let us gather these truths into a single, clear understanding. Prayer is not your effort to bring God to you. Prayer is the awareness that God has never left. Every time you pause, even for a moment, and acknowledge the presence within, the illusion of separation loosens. Every time you rest in the silent assurance that God is the life you are living, fear dissolves. Every time you withdraw your energy from pleading and turn inward to recognition, harmony begins to flow. You do not make it flow. Divine harmony is ever flowing. You simply stop obstructing it with mistaken identity. Understand this deeply. You do not need to persuade God. You do not need to prove yourself worthy. You do not need enough faith, enough holiness, enough discipline to earn God's attention. You already live in the fullness of God's attention. You already dwell in the embrace of infinite love. You already move within the life that is God itself. Your work now is not to strive, but to remember, not to achieve, but to awaken, not to become, but to recognize. You will forget at times, every seeker does. You will fall back into old habits of fear or pleading. You will feel the pull of human conditioning, but do not condemn yourself when this happens. That, too, is only the echo of the old self. When you notice it, gently return to truth. Softly, without judgment, turn again to recognition. And if you must return 100 times a day, then return 100 times a day. Each return weakens the illusion. Each return strengthens the awareness of truth. Each return draws you deeper into the realization that the presence you seek is the presence you are. So as we part for now, carry this with you. You are God's spiritual offspring, complete, whole, and beloved. This is not a hope. This is not a promise. This is not a future attainment. This is the eternal fact of your being. May you walk in recognition. May you rest in the silent assurance of oneness. May you discover, moment by moment, the peace that requires no request, the supply that requires no pleading, the love that requires no permission. And may your prayer from this day forward be the prayer of realization. God is here. God is the life I am. Nothing can separate me from the infinite that lives me. With this awareness, you are free.